Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este tercer panel de nuestro coloquio Legados de la eugenesia en México y las Américas. Soy Susana Antevi y para mí es un gran honor, un placer presentar a nuestros panelistas en esta mesa que tiene como título Permutaciones eugenésicas en tiempo y espacio. Primero les voy a leer las semblanzas de nuestros tres participantes, nuestros tres panelistas, y después escucharemos las ponencias. Al final habrá oportunidad para preguntas y discusión. Primero tenemos al doctor Gustavo Vallejo. Es doctor en historia y se desempeña como investigador del CONICET. Su sede de trabajo es el Instituto de Salud Colectiva de la Universidad Nacional de Lanús. Allí desarrolla también su labor docente, tarea que además realiza en las Universidades Nacionales de La Plata y de 13 de febrero. En sus investigaciones ha abordado temas inmersos en la historia de la cultura científica.
Problems such as the social usage of biological theories during the 19th and 20th century and its relationship with national identities and the emergence of the modern cities. Our second panelist is PhD Marisa Miranda. She is a PhD on judicial sciences, main researcher in CONICET, Argentina. She is a postgraduate professor. She has published a number of papers in chapters of books and many publications as a co-editor. Her book, Control the Uncontrollable, A History of Sexuality in Argentina of 2011, and Mother and the Country in Argentina in 2020. That's her main line of investigation. The studies of biopolitics and sexuality and eugenics. And our third panelist, Guadalupe Varena, a PhD in her academic activities. She develops different projects in human rights, including the creation of indicators of human rights. She's also developed a project of investigation on the clinical teaching in Mexico and Latin America. She has been professor for more than 15 years in National University of Mexico and other universities. She is part of the university program of human rights at the National University of Mexico. Also, she has a multidisciplinary workshop with students of law, psychology, social works, journalism, and she has supervised more than 200 cases of human rights among violence victims, etc. She's part of the panel of the Global Alliance for Justice Education. She made a master's degree in human rights and specialty in European law and a PhD on the Judicial Investigation Institute of the National University of Mexico. So thank you. And we are going to start.
Well, I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this important meeting, and I especially congratulate its organizers. My presentation is entitled, What is Eugenics for? Scientific Culture, Ideology, Politics, and Religion in Argentine Eugenics, Hypotheses for a Long-Term Study. And the idea is to raise a series of questions that allow us to see eugenics as an epiphenomenon of broader political and social problems, or also an expression of the way in which different moments of crisis were approached from the interference demanded, the knowledge that legitimizes ideas and praxis capable of recomposing order. In that sense, I will start by highlighting a few things about eugenics. On the one hand, it is an expression of power that manifests itself as a problem that concerns the society in which it is immersed. Therefore, its sole existence concerns the political, scientific, religious fields. It is integrated within these three spheres. It is not an anomaly of politics, science, and religion. It always implies a subjugation of rights, and this is because it is an expression of biological determinism that served to scientifically justify social inequalities. Whenever there are inequalities, some lose a lot and others win at the expense of those who lose. And with that, hegemonies are affirmed based on the power exercised at the political, scientific, and religious levels. It has a historical development in which there is a steady rise to a point when it becomes huge, a moment of enormous and regrettable significance during the Holocaust, and then we see a subsequent decline, although what we intend to demonstrate is that in Argentina, it particularly maintained historical continuity, as we will see. Well, to begin with, as we well know, Galton created a neologism to describe a practice that dates back to the origins of Western culture. In this case, one can think in relation to another term, that of utopia, created by Thomas More in modern times to describe ways of approaching reality from a shift towards imagination, with the most diverse derivations, Plato being his great exponent in the classical world. Eugenics and utopia share many things in common, starting with that etymological origin, distance in time from ideas, which in both cases was in classical Greece. They also share the fascination for a perfect society in which individual rights are given up on behalf of collective well-being. And another common element is the place where these notions arise, which takes us back through Thomas More and Galton to England's condition of insularity. But eugenics is related to both utopia and its negation, which is dystopia, a notion conceived in the second half of the 19th century. It was another English thinker, John Stuart Mill, who used that word to thematize an undesirable society in itself, which will be what eugenics warns can happen without its intervention. So eugenics is related to both utopia and dystopia, that is, with a perfect society that longs for, and with the identified evils that it denounces. It has a common Greek root and a reinvocation to it made from the same place. And there we always return to the English insularity as a central fact, because the island is also a geographical and cultural characteristic that made recognizable limits unavoidable, encouraging us to think about how to best manage the resources that are possessed in relation to its inhabitants. From that island, in which we identified the aforementioned problems, the reflection on the principle of scarcity also arose, such as the one that Thomas Malthus established for a limited territory where the population grew more than food. Thus, eugenics emerged as a way to guarantee proper administration of resources, providing key information to governments to discuss how to distribute those resources in a fair way, in biological rather than social terms. For this, eugenics has started from identifying what would only represent an unjustified expense for the state, and who, on the other hand, would be in a position to return the initial investment made by them. With this, the apt and the inept became sharply divided. And what followed was the proposal to establish mechanisms of differential reproduction for them. The eugenic utopia preserves a tendency to reduce human complexity as a result of a homogenizing plan able to satisfy the intimate desires of those who project their desire to gather all the good that they imagine associated with themselves into the future. That is, whoever comes up with the plan will always value us. This entails a contrast for those who are othered, understood as a radical opposition to what they seek, also seeking to make their descendants disappear. We contrast the creation of the utopia of all things good to the dystopia that homogenizes the characteristics of what represents everything inherently bad. This concept becomes synthesized within a place, a social group, an ideology, or a belief. Early eugenicists themselves classified the measures they implemented as either positive or negative eugenics. The difference was not always clear because the opposition of the superior and the inferior was always the major underlying principle. This capacity was self-attributed by those pronouncing this definition of what is good and how to guide the improvement of the race by pursuing that predetermined good. The measures that we can include in positive eugenics have to do with environmental changes, with changes in education, health, the selection of spouses to have good offspring. And in the negative, we can clearly locate the most dramatic solutions that explode in genetic unchangeability reflected through such practices as sterilization. Eugenicists invoke two biological traditions to support either of the two alternatives. For the positive, they held that environmental changes could influence the offspring, as Lamarckian theory said about acquired characteristics, while those who supported the negative only counted the biological inheritance, as explained by Mendel, such that improvement of the race required drastically removing those less fit from the reproductive process. But beyond the differences and the blurred points of contact between one eugenics and another, there are patterns common to all eugenics. We can review these briefly. On the one hand, the differences between individuals are determined by heredity and depend only to a very small extent on the environment. The question of the environment allows for the inclusion of Lamarckism. Progress depends on natural selection and the struggle for life. Since then, advances in medicine, social assistance, charity, and altruism led to the undesired consequence of putting the brakes on selection imposed by nature. Therefore, it was up to eugenics to complete that process that had been truncated by modern life and conduct artificial selection to regenerate the race. Eugenics was seen as coming before natural selection to avoid the social and economic costs of the struggle for life and thus eliminate from the reproductive process those who are predicted to lose that struggle. Eugenics, in any of its variants, focuses its attention on reproduction, whether it be genetic eugenics itself or, in its contextual circumstances, environmental eugenics. Now, the interpretations formulated about the profound ethical differences came to exist between genetic, or Anglo-Saxon eugenics, and environmental, or Lamarckian eugenics were often supported in turn with explanations of the role that science, politics, and religion should have had in the control of eugenics. And here we return to the starting point to say that when power was removed from the focus of the scene as the explanatory axis of all eugenic formulation, things were sustained that we did not share, such as that in the scientific plane, eugenics was seen as an anomaly within science. Sometimes it is catalogued as a meta-science originating from purposes completely alien to it. On the political level, liberalism was seen as a limit to the abuses of power, moderating the extremes in a kind of political homeostasis, tending to make unviable issues such as authoritarianism and also eugenics. In terms of religion, the Catholic Church was assigned the role of opposition, expressing unequivocal rejection of eugenics, which would have been necessary to prevent or moderate its spread in Latin countries. However, and to introduce the Argentine case, we will say that, as in other realities, in Argentina, eugenics was nothing more than a genuine expression of the scientific field, not a regular deviation from its course, and provided enormous visibility and major academic recognition. Liberalism, with the particularities of our region, and in Argentina especially, did not act as a brake, but rather provided the possibility for the development of eugenics. The analogy between the Darwinian struggle for life and the aptitude for competition in the market society was constitutive in eugenics under ultraliberalism, the Victorian society that gave rise to it. And that was what centrally inspired Argentina's first response to it. Over time, eugenics was consolidated at the expense of channeling fears and desires for control of fascist regimes, but also of that liberalism that gave rise to eugenics. Eugenics found in the Catholic Church, more than an ally, a constitutive factor of its essence, as we will see. In short, liberalism and Catholicism, even making use of different means, were not always, nor generally, at the antipodes of eugenics, as would be the case with any political or cultural practice that exerted coercion over the will of individuals, as we tend to believe. It was not that supposed barrier that got in the way of the advance of eugenics, but rather spaces of agreement through which Galton's science flowed. The relationship between eugenics and the Catholic Church, that a priori was raised as ineffable, can be traced from the discourses themselves and the institutions involved. Indeed, there was an explicit unity of thought and action that only interrupted a particular form of eugenics, such as those advocating for the adoption of practices such as sterilization or birth control. So now we see what has been so difficult to understand, that eugenics in Argentina was an ally of science, liberalism, and religion. Another important issue has to do with an added premise, namely the chronological order in relation to the Holocaust. This terrible event also had its origin in approaches to eugenics and to ways of thinking that we believe are inaccurate. One is rejecting outright the possibility of discernment about the consequences of eugenics before the horrors of Nazism were known, and the other is not taking into account that after finding out about those horrors, there would be some sort of continuity. This would lead us again to think that it is inevitable to search for eugenics beyond the Holocaust, not beforehand because there would have been no awareness of it, and not after because having awareness, it would not have been possible to carry it out. However, what we are going to state clearly here, that eugenics existed in a very conscious way before Nazism, of course during Nazism, and also after Nazism. Focusing then on the Argentine case, what I'm interested in raising and answering the question in the title a bit is what eugenics was used for. What were the main motives over time that urged us to resort to eugenics? And in this sense, we are going to see that in Argentina, there were four great motivations. The first had to do with containing the flood of immigration since 1880. The second was to contain the social reaction that ensued at the end of the Great War with internal conflicts and the threat of undesirable immigration. The third has to do with containing the social consequences of the 1929 crash and accompanying the responses provided by fascism. And the fourth, since the 1950s, was to position itself in the Cold War, repelling the cultural changes that were associated with the advance of communism. Among all these motivations, there is a common factor, which is the presence of a liberalism frightened by social conflict, which is always prone to overstepping the bounds of political legitimacy. That is to say, super-constitutional liberalism that was deployed within the rule of law, and when it could not do it that way, forcing the establishment states of exception. And those fears also ended up dissolving the disagreements that once existed with the Catholic Church, by appealing to a higher interest that united them, namely to maintain the instituted order. Eugenics, with different modulations, adapted to this need that rested on the maintenance of a political, cultural, and religious hegemony. In this sense, it can also be thought that these four moments, with their particular problems that eugenics came to address, follow one another, without each new stage implying a radically different proposal from the previous one. In this case, it is possible to resort to the figure of the palimpsest, that ancient form of writing that entailed one argument that contained a previous one, to think in similar terms about the superimposed layers that at some point also reveal the new and the old within the same format, which in this case would be eugenics. That is to say, those key events and the answers that eugenics provides are different, but that does not prevent us from recognizing a substrate of continuities. When we speak of the first moment of eugenics coming to Argentina, linked to the need to contain the migratory flood, we are situated in the 1880s, at almost the exact time that Galton gave a name to his science that had already arrived in Argentina. It is about this moment in which the national organization is carried out with the implementation of modern and civilized institutions that allowed the nascent state to become one of the most efficient world economies. A key factor in this process was the role assumed by the agricultural bourgeoisie, which in its alliance with the military institution, the political field, the scientific field, managed to install an agenda based on the expansion of arable lands at the expense of the extermination of the indigenous people who occupied them. This situation encouraged the development of new modes of agricultural production and generated an intense migration policy, directed especially at bringing in settlers from Europe in a form of racial substitution to make up for the population void following the drastic resolution of the so-called indigenous question. But the immigrants who arrived in numbers quite out of proportion to the existing population were, for the most part, not the ones the country had hoped for. They came from the poorer regions of Italy and Spain, not from central northern Europe. And they did not always obey their expected place in the social order. With them also came socialism and anarchism unexpectedly. But in addition, they also brought aspirations for social advancement, which they often achieved, not without ruffling the feathers of the local elites. Thus, we see that eugenics in Argentina in the last part of the 19th century provided arguments that favored the interests of agricultural producers. In fact, an agricultural school created to improve production in the rural world with a view to increasing exports was based on a particular theory of inheritance in 1886, which consisted of adapting Galton's central ideas about improving human societies to the improvement of livestock. The Argentine author of this particular theory was Alfredo Biraben. Another way eugenics was inserted into society at the end of the 19th century can be found in the scientific answers that arose in response to the indigenous question. And here I'm interested in highlighting those answers that appeared at the end of the military action as a way to legitimize as important to the country's progress, since by homogenizing the population, races that interfered with progress were being eliminated. Therefore, science had to show those indigenous people as beings removed from history who were nothing but expressions of prehistory, for which there was only one place, namely the Museum of Natural Sciences, a place to exhibit their skeletons, or even surviving families that were housed in anthropological rooms where they spent the last days of their lives. The important thing was to show their otherness in relation to an urban population that flocked to see these new exhibition spaces. But at the same time, the exhibits were there to warn them that what they were seeing as belonging to prehistory could reappear, to put our modern organization at risk if the repressive actions were not kept up. Eugenics also flourished alongside the ills attributed to immigration, especially when it was blamed in 1890 for the first economic, social, and political crisis that this new state suffered, the modern state that had just been born. Immigration brought careerists and criminals who encouraged the revolution. That was the diagnosis that a certain literary genre that became popular at that time warned of. The plot of such naturalistic novels used scientific resources, including biological theories of the impact on medicine and criminology, with special emphasis on eugenics. Among the main authors of this genre are Antonio Argarich and Eugenio Cambaceres. In one case, the degeneration caused by the immigration process was reflected in the eloquent title of Are They Innocent or Guilty? Another book's title contained a definitive answer. In the blood. This was how immigrants brought evil. They carried it in their blood. And going beyond this cultural identification with evil to unite the individual criminal act with the group to which he or she belongs, fingerprinting was born from the efforts of an official of the Buenos Aires Provincial Police, Juan Vucetic, who went further into the ideas sketched by Galton himself after maintaining correspondence with him. This led to a reorganization of the repressive structure. It also dovetailed with a new science of power contributed by Lombroso and that quickly had a great spread in Argentina from criminology, first to decisively impacting areas such as medicine, education, and law. In the early years of the 20th century, physical anthropology, psychiatry, and positivist psychology made up a field of inquiries, including doctors of enormous renown such as José Ingenieros, Ramos Mejía, Horacio Pinheiro, educators such as Victor Mercante, and jurists such as Carlos Octavio Bunge and Eusebio Gomez. All of them were united by the desire to integrate a biological look at the application of social phenomena, dealing with issues ranging from denouncing the fakery in the struggle for life as a resource that losers use so as not to perish and spread their evils through society, and warning about the spread of low life, a figure created by the less distinguished followers of Lombroso in Italy to the point of becoming obsessed with measuring abilities in school to make correct selections of the fittest. A second important moment for the development of eugenics in Argentina is in 1918. The Argentine Eugenics Society was born there, led by Gregorio Alfaro and Victor Delfino. They followed the example of the society recently created in Brazil by Renato Kell, and a very varied agenda of problems was opened up from the political point of view. It sought to counteract a climate of agitation installed by the university reform throughout the country, encouraging the maintenance of the established order. They were allied with Ceballos, a former naturalist who collected indigenous remains for public display. He was now a member of the Eugenic Society, and from his new role as dean of the Faculty of Law, he sought to deactivate the student movement, mainly due to the international signals that came with the triumphant Russian Revolution, which was seen as a propagating vehicle of that agitation. And in fact, in January 1919, a strike in a factory ended in what was called Tragic Week, which sharply marked a limit of what was tolerable by the Argentine elites. An institution very close to the ideals of the Eugenic Society was the Argentine Social Museum, and there was one initiative that precisely reflected that communion of ideas. In 1919, a survey on desirable immigration was conducted, which brought together the most prominent figures in the political field. The questions expressed the great fear about the type of immigration that Argentina would receive after the Great War ended. The fear now was mainly that Russians and Jews would come. The former were considered to be subject to a collective defect that led them to produce revolutions wherever they went, and the latter for being considered an unassimilable race. That is how they were seen. The Argentine Eugenic Society also had on its agenda to address social poisons such as alcoholism, syphilis, and tuberculosis. As these diseases were considered as a product of the bad life, the imagined preventive plan undertook to moralize about these customs. While the tragic weak managed to discipline social demands, the greatest demands were aimed at addressing such social poisons. This led to a decline for the Eugenic Society as another institution emerged, dealing with these functions more directly. I am referring to the Social Prophylaxis League led by the Dr. Alfredo Fernández Verano since 1921. To a large extent, the latter absorbed the Eugenic Society, which in a short time ceased to function. A third important moment in the development of eugenics in Argentina had to do with the impact generated by the 1929 crash and the need to contain its social consequences. In the institutional political order, the crisis led to the first coup that Argentina underwent and the repositioning of the elites in the leadership of the country, overthrowing Hipólito Yrigoyen, a president from a modest background. With the military coup of 1930, eugenics found great encouragement. Italy became the example to follow, and within the framework of the ties established with fascism, Nicolás Pende arrived in Argentina as part of a greater plan to generate cultural colonization to turn Argentina into a beacon for the spread of fascism in South America. Pende was an endocrinologist who created an Italian version of eugenics that he called biotypology, and with which he insinuated himself into the highest echelons of the regime, thus achieving his goal of uniting science and politics through knowledge that very effectively integrated itself with followers of organicism. This movement considered the cells and tissues in an individual's body as equivalent to the various population groups that comprise the social body. The function of eugenics was then to identify the right place for each person to occupy in society. To identify that right place, Pende created the Biotypological Institute, where he implemented an instrument aimed at producing archives of biological, anthropometric, psychotechnical, and moral profiles of entire populations, in which the state of health and predispositions to illness, along with the physical, psychic, and moral predispositions were collected, as well as hereditary data. The studies were led by a transdisciplinary team whose central figures were Pende and a priest, Mario Barbara. And here, a singular feature of this eugenics appears that has to do with the religious imprint of a scientific formulation. Agostino Gemelli had been the one with whom the Catholic Church had developed links since the beginning of Italian biotypology. That was the general situation of Italy, and Pende had to offer Argentina in the matter of eugenics. And accordingly, one of the first decisions of the emerging military dictatorship was to entrust the task of training two young doctors, Arturo Ros and Octavio Lopez, in an official training mission led by Pende. When the two of them returned, an institution was born in Argentina that came to prolong the development of eugenics in Italy and at the same time to serve to spearhead the spread of fascism in the Southern Cone. It was the Argentine Association of Biotypology, Eugenics, and Social Medicine, born with the support of the state. This institution created a wide network of doctors, lawyers, educators, and architects, and quickly launched its communication arm, the Annals of Biotypology, in 1932. And in 1934, the Institute of Biotypology and the School of Biotypology were born. With this platform, the Argentine biotypologists determined their plan of action internally and signed agreements with public institutions to develop profiles of various groups. Externally, they publicized Pende's model in other countries of South America to set up branch leadership throughout the Latin countries on behalf of Rome through eugenics. The rapid local repercussion generated by the Vatican's position on eugenics was also important. The Church was to be the first eugenic institution because it was Church doctrine to encourage the best offspring through premarital counseling. This was stated, for example, by the encyclical Casti Connubii. However, the Church rejected the type of eugenics that coercively intervenes directly on bodies the way Nazism did, or that separated sexual pleasure from reproduction as promoted by the neo-Malthusians, including anarchists and early feminists. In 1934, this fusion between church and eugenics was completed through the development of the International Eucharistic Congress, held in Buenos Aires, where Cardinal Pacelli and then Pius XII and Cardinal Gomá, then a central figure in Franco's regime in Spain, played a very important role. The Argentine Association of Biotypology brought priests onto its staff and permanently followed the positions of the Argentine Church and the position of the national state from 1930 until the middle of the Second World War. And precisely its strong politicization would make it suffer the consequences of the fall of fascism, from which it could not escape, and therefore closed down completely in 1944. So now we proceed to the fourth milestone in the historical evolution of eugenics in Argentina. It is identified with the end of the Second World War, and its raison d'etre then morphed into the concerns of the Cold War. Eugenics would be called on to contain the advance of an invisible monster that threatened to sneak in, producing disastrous consequences in the social order. That monster was communism, and everything that would conflict with established ideas and values then carried that label. The leader of Argentine eugenics was now Carlos Bernaldo de Quirós, a lawyer who had been part of the Biotypology Association. This lawyer, in 1945, created the Argentine Eugenic Society, launching its communication organ, carrying out activities in the Argentine Social Museum. However, the advent of Peronism marked an impasse. The disputes that Quirós and the Social Museum had with the new political movement made a dent in both institutions, the Eugenic Society and the Social Museum. The latter, in fact, was intervened and closed, with which the true moment of splendor of post-Holocaust eugenics in Argentina would begin in 1955, when a military coup overthrew the Perón government and restored the autonomy of the Social Museum. The coup also repositioned the Catholic Church in spheres such as education, and in response to its claim, private universities were authorized to operate. With this measure, the new Catholic universities were born, of course, but the University of the Social Museum was also born, in which the Faculty of Eugenics was headed by Bernaldo de Quirós. An important stage in Argentine eugenics began here, with the singularity of developing when in many places they had stopped talking about eugenics, and even more so, the fact of opening the new flagship institution that came to train university students to implement Galton's science. The Faculty of Eugenics consolidated a corpus based mainly on Pende, as well as a neo-Lamarckian framework that relies on improvement produced by the effect of changes in the environment. But what comes after this certainty is an immoderate vocation to intervene in all possible spaces to prevent the infiltration of the communist monster, attacking the morality of Argentine customs. Argentine eugenics thereby affirmed its social function, exalting an opposition between normal and abnormal, virtue and vice, and between traditional customs and modern life. The woman taking care of the home versus the new woman in the miniskirt and the pill, the normal man and the long-haired guerrilla hippie. Traditional gender roles and non-reproductive sexualities. And under that framework, eugenics, led by Bernaldo de Quirós, accompanied those enacting successive coups d'etat. Quirós died in 1973, and the faculty functioned until 1980, because those de facto governments guaranteed control of morality that had run amok in modern life. That was the environmental interpretation that was given to eugenics, which was very reactionary in culture and never ignoring the political needs of the elites. To close, then, and in review, let us also say that eugenics in Argentina had significant expressions throughout a century that ranged from performative discourses and different praxis to societies with academic recognition. Eugenics legitimized ways of excluding a succession of others. At the end of the 19th century, they were the original peoples. After the end of the Great War, they were immigrants of maladjusted races who could degenerate the population through bad life or social unrest. After the crash of 1929, when immigration stopped, the population itself was seen as dangerous because it had not been sufficiently improved through contact with Europeans. It therefore had to be disciplined through the example of fascism and improved by the application of biotypology. After the Second World War, with the specter of communist invasion, eugenics appealed more strongly to the neo-Lamarckian framework in order to repel that danger, contributing more emphatically to moralize people's customs. That is to say, throughout this entire journey we have sketched out, we have seen eugenics act as a legitimating instrument on behalf of political and cultural hegemonies. And in summary, and returning to what served us as a starting point, we wish to close by highlighting that the presence of eugenics in Argentina challenges the scientific, political, and religious spheres. It is, as its core, the expression of certain systems of exclusion proposed from those fields that, in one way or another, dialogue with eugenics. So, thank you very much. Pleasure to share this space with you, to ask us some questions, and contribute some ideas regarding eugenics and the eugenic aspects that have occurred during the 20th century or have been established historiographically during the 20th century. Well, we're going to begin by noting that eugenics would occupy a place that intersects biology and politics. We know it's a discipline enunciated by Francis Galton as a science of the cultivation of the race applicable to men, beasts, and plants. This is Galton's concept that necessarily implies the interference of the human being, preempting natural selection, in order to eliminate from the reproductive process those who are expected to lose in that Darwinian struggle for life. So clearly, there are some aspects that we can detect initially to begin this talk. To begin with, eugenics as a proposal to improve the race necessarily implies the reproductive dimension, and therefore the future. And this seems clear since it is not possible to think of a eugenics that only focuses on the present day. If eugenics focuses on the present day, it is always with a view to the control of reproduction or of the product of future reproduction. So there are two aspects on which we are going to pivot. One of them has to do with the concept of reproduction and the controls of that reproduction, which is the proposal that we are going to submit here to analysis that will have a direct link with the historiographically detected variants or aspects, and also, therefore, the future dimension. Well, from this perspective, two versions of eugenics have been analyzed. One called Anglo-Saxon, characteristic of North American and German applications, and another called Latin, characteristic of Italian and Spanish authoritarianisms, and in Argentina and various Latin American countries. Let's see. Basically, the difference between the eugenic paths has been defined in that the Anglo-Saxon eugenics propitiated and, in fact, carried out direct interventions in bodies or in reproductive organs. The enactment of the first sterilization law in the state of Indiana in the United States at the beginning of the last century in 1907 is well known. And another terrible example that reaches the paroxysm of the application of eugenics is obviously the example of Nazi Germany. Okay. On the other hand, we are going to find the difference that historiography has made between Anglo-Saxon and Latin eugenics, in that the Latin version is organized around more subtle forms of intervention in reproduction and informed by the Casti Connubii, an encyclical of the Catholic Church sanctioned in 1930. Hence, Anglo-Saxon eugenics was characterized by explicit coercion, while Latin eugenics was closer to implicit or concealed coercion, even though I'm going to suggest that we pause on the idea that, according to the criteria of analysis that I propose, both types of eugenics involved coercion. Good. So, the initiative that we are now debating has to do with proposing an analysis from two epistemic planes, one theoretical and the other practical. Let's see what we find when analyzing eugenic aspects. Hence, for example, if we pause at the theoretical level, we must necessarily identify key principles that support this theory. Among the key principles that sustain eugenics, we are going to find the idea of the identification of beings, the classification, that is, the grouping according to previous identification, the grouping of certain beings with certain characteristics in classes, races, ideologies, and so on. From there, the hierarchy, that is, the classification, does not follow a scheme that we could call egalitarian, but rather appears with the idea, or is actually carried out, in order to rank those beings considered desirable or that nation-states have wanted to promote via reproduction, while nation-states have discouraged and rejected the reproduction of those at the bottom of this hierarchical list. Okay, and finally, about them. That is, about those for whom nation-states have considered the design of policies, biopolitics, to exclude them from reproduction in general, or because of the possibility or potentiality of generating or engendering gestenic beings, or in other words, contrary to eugenics. Hence, we hold that the theoretical plane is valid for both versions of eugenics. Why? Well, because in all cases, it was necessary to identify, classify, rank, and exclude, even though later, at the practical level, differences do appear. Clearly, we are going to find these differences associated with the praxis of the implementation of the theoretical postulates to carry out this artificial selection. Here we reiterate there are clear differences between the two eugenic tendencies, even though for the Argentine case, we find hybridizations, or what we might call impure formulations of Latin eugenics. Here, if we pause to consider the first tendency, the bloodiest, in a manner of speaking, that is, the Anglo-Saxon, the exclusion of the other, the identified, classified, hierarchized, and excluded as other, occurs through the use of biopolitics that allow for invasive operations on their reproductive organs. Among these are compulsive sterilizations to the point of genocide. On the other hand, the practical level of the Latin tendency has been characterized by a series of biopolitical strategies conditioned by a marked influence of the Catholic Church, from which the union between sexuality and procreation, sexuality for procreation, has been considered as inseparable, and then it was necessary to control sexuality to control procreation. Well, in addition, control within this area, the control of sexual morality, marriage prohibitions for those who were predicted to engender dysgenic offspring, and incentives for the reproduction of the fittest, as well as disincentives for the reproduction of the least fit. In short, exclusion of the other through forms of coercion that we have called covert. Now, as we noted in reference to the Latin eugenic tendency, the role of the Catholic Church is fundamental, and even though the Catholic Church supported eugenics before the encyclical, it is true that from 1930, this encyclical, issued by Pope Pius XI, imposed the avoidance of, or more than imposed, it favored the avoidance of marriage between those who were expected to only engender defective children. Now, this is a very brief synthesis of the encyclical in which, based on it and the documents that were subsequently issued to clarify the scope of this ecclesiastical document, this position, the position of the Church, was clearly anti-sterilization, even when it promoted a confessional eugenics. It has been said, and since 1924, that is why I say it is a little earlier than this encyclical, it has been said that the Church is the first eugenicist. Okay, what's more, in this context, the presence of doctors is not a minor fact. Basically, endocrinologists, who later on were very close to the fascist regime. Among them, the fundamental, or the one with the greatest presence, was Dr. Nicola Pende, who was a supporter of racist theories and one of the ideologues of the Manifesto of the Race, issued in 1938 in fascist Italy. Well, Nicola Pende, it is worth clarifying, has had a notable influence in Argentina. In which period of Argentina? Well, beginning in 1930. This is a periodization that we have done in which we find that from 1930 until well into the 20th century, what we have is a shift to the right or towards an adhesion to eugenics. Why am I saying this? Well, because the entry of eugenics into the country was accepted by various ideologies, a wide ideological spectrum, from the left to the right, even though, since 1930, together with the dismantling of anarchism and various ties that were strengthened with European totalitarian regimes, we find that the eugenic tendency shifted to the right. That is, the left became aware of the incompatibility, if you will, of its postulates or its ideology with the proposals that were being carried out fundamentally since the arrival of Nicolas Pende in Argentina. This man, this doctor, came to our country in 1930, precisely at the time of Argentina's first coup d'etat. Okay, this eugenic principle that we might call right-wing or monopolized, a eugenic field monopolized by the right, has continued even after the Second World War, a time at which, as is well known, eugenics became a very disputed word, and many international magazines, for example, which until then were called eugenics, well, they changed their name. Okay. On the other hand, in Argentina, eugenics continued and grew stronger. Why am I saying it grew stronger? Well, because, for example, in 1957, the world's first and only eugenics faculty was founded in the middle of the Cold War. Well, clearly, the other in this case was no longer the Jew and was no longer the black. The other was the Marxist. Well, and a faculty that would use the return to democracy to conceal its eugenic tendencies, and in which we could say that there were some remains or residues of these ideas, but much more disjointed and not so established, since they were completely lacking in institutional representation. So I propose to consider two key aspects towards the end of the 1930s, fundamentally with the first Latin Congress of Eugenics in Paris and the weak Third Pan-American Conference of Eugenics in Bogotá. A definitive split was also consolidated at the institutional level between eugenic tendencies, the Anglo-Saxon and the Latin, coinciding with the United States' formal distancing from eugenics beginning in 1945. A second key aspect to consider is that Latin eugenics acquires a greater prominence, if you will, until later, once the issue of the Nazis' use of eugenics becomes known. For example, with the Peruvian Eugenics Conference, and upholds the continuity of its postulates, far exceeding, as we noted, the Anglo-Saxon formulations. Here, it is relevant to consider the question that we were referring to about the founding of the Faculty of Eugenics that issued university degrees of eugenicist, humanologist, and various biopolitical eugenic strategies of reproductive control. Then let's see, by way of synthesis, what I want to note is that the biopolitical links between Argentina and Italy and Spain, although they were fundamental in the confirmation of the Latin eugenic network, were reinforced by a regional debate that also included the postulates sustained by the Anglo-Saxon side. And on this, for example, we can mention that sterilization, or at least the proposals for massive sterilization of dysgenic beings, obviously in quotes again, in our country, in Argentina, were not successful due to doubts about the effectiveness of the treatments and not because of the essential ethical questions regarding these measures. This has been reiterated in innumerable congresses, parliamentary debates, and even national and international congresses. Also envisaged was the possibility of a eugenics in which the children of the detained and disappeared of the last Argentine military dictatorship would be separated from their mothers, as was done under the Franco regime. And they would be introduced into an environment saturated with morality. Obviously, in this concept, who made up this oversaturated environment of morality? Let's be clear. Well, those close to the 1976-1983 military dictatorship, or also those who were close to the Catholic Church. Well then, in that sense, at the eugenic level, and as Vallejo would promote it, from Franco Spain, the child who had genes, we could say at the time, as the Spanish psychiatrist Vallejo referred to it, genes that would lead him to become a future communist. This psychiatrist spoke of having found the red gene. In this way, this gene could be neutralized if the child was guarded or raised, rather, by a family that was morally recommendable, so that morality was embedded in him, a potential leftist. Okay, this has actually been reflected in various statements made by daughters and sons of the detained and disappeared in Argentina. Well, for this reason, we can be sure that the survival of eugenics has continued beyond the institutional level and the faculty that I mentioned, and everything has continued until at least the end of the last military dictatorship. Well, folks, it's been a huge pleasure sharing these ideas with you, and, well, I look forward to comments, debates, points of view, so that we can all nourish ourselves with mutual reflections. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Quisiera dar las gracias al Instituto de Estudios Críticos.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the 17 Institute of Critical Studies for the invitation. Thanks to the colleagues that are along with me in the seminar. I am Guadalupe Varena. I'm a lawyer. And I would like to talk a little bit about my approach to eugenics in Mexico from the point of view of the regulation, the current regulation in Mexico.
Como punto de partida, les quisiera comentar.
From a start point, I would like to tell you that the judicial regulation in Mexico are on the civil law, on the civil legislation, which is different for the people. I mean, people can be underage or older. underage, under 18 years old, who exercise their rights through a representative, and the same thing happens with people with disabilities. And not only people with disabilities, but with other condition. The regulation says that people with certain conditions that I'm not going to mention can be subject to different types of conditions. This is delicate because there are some specific clauses that are established in the different codes of the different countries. Therefore, there is a federal government, there are 32 local governments, each of which can issue regulations. I will now talk a little bit some results about the civil codes, some research we made on the civil codes of the country. This is a work that we've been doing with Maria Fernanda Pinjus. So I am sharing just some preliminary annotations.
Perdón. Muy importante, en primer lugar, la estructura legal.
It's important to know the legal structure that divide people with certain capabilities or disabilities from the rest of the population. In the beginning, the codes express or explain who has a capability, who has the personality, and it's characterized or is distinguished from those who exercise their rights, because rights can be exercised through a third party, like in the case of people under 18 years old, like mothers, fathers, tutors, or people with disabilities who also exercise their rights through tutors, just as if they were underage. Legally, and in the local states, there are 12 states that define this universe of people who can be subject to interdiction because they have a disability. And they point out attributes of the person, like maybe someone with disabilities that is over 18 years old. So it's frequent to even find wording such as deaf and mute, also drunk, and people who use who have an immoderate use of drugs and substances. So this is these are the characteristics that can lead to a person that a person cannot be able to exercise their rights. So besides elements such as the ones I just mentioned, this need to be, or this go hand in hand with the impossibility of speaking freely. So this is important because it means how the judicial system thinks about people, especially those who are within this framework. So we notice after this review is that all of the civil codes of the country establish some some situations that are to prevent getting married, like maybe disabilities or other conditions that I previously mentioned, like the use of substances, drugs,
morfinomanía, la heteromanía, otras cosas parecidas. Y estos atributos
and these attributes I just mentioned that are more explicitly linked to disabilities, like being unable of understanding, or people who do not understand what is the facts. So these are some specific examples. In the state of Coahuila, in the legal structure, it says that every person that can be subject to an interdiction needs to have a specific determination of what the person can do and what they cannot do. In the state of Colima and Durango specifically, there's an interdiction for people with intellectual disability. The interdiction prohibits in the state of Mexico to get married if you have any mental health issue, or
en el estado de Tlaxcala,
in the state of Tlaxcala, psychiatric or mental problems, and in the state of Zacatecas, mental illness or a state of disability. So this is what stands out after the review we made. And these are some requirements and some elements that could make you, well, that can forbid you from getting married. Another finding that's homogeneous in the different codes is the power that parents have over their children. A person under 18 cannot exercise the rights or any right by themselves. So either the mother or the father or a tutor, they exercise the rights on behalf of the underage person.
Ahora, este marco legal,
now, this legal framework clearly is, faces a situation with the cases of people with disabilities. There are some codes, like here, the Article 23 about home and family, that says that people have the right to freely decide the number of children they want to have, to get married, to live in equality with the rest of the people. Article 26 also establishes that the access to custody and legal authority over children, because there are legal elements over their children, and the states need to provide effective legal assistance in case they need. The fourth paragraph is important. In any case, an underage person should be separated from their parents based on their disabilities. Now, what does this have to do with eugenics? The question for me, or what I would like to take note in terms of legislation, is why we care, or why the government cares about this, why the international law on family, or the family law, is or has something to say on some private circumstances such as family, especially when it comes to a state that adopts a regulation to then again regulate the relationships between individuals. The codes in Mexico, most of them, according to the type of codes that we're using, they come from the 1930s, where the law, it's called the Code of 1928. It's a social code. That is, it's trying to make a balance between the individual interests and the general interests. This is important because it goes also hand in hand with the project of the state, of the government. Some experts have already studied. Some of you have mentioned it. I just wanted to point out that in this historical stage, we're talking about legislation on family law. We have the background. word a certificate of marriage is thought of to be adopted, and it becomes mandatory. You need a certificate to establish that you're not ill of any of the sicknesses that are listed on the code. It's interesting for me as a lawyer that even the Convention of People with Disabilities here in Mexico, and although it is present, the codes are present, many of these rules and many of these regulations come from 1926, 1930. And the question is why? And I'm going to read an example on the motive explanation in the Civil Code of Veracruz in 1932. At the time, it was Governor Tejeda, along with Galles. It was in 1926. And he goes like, for the same reasons, and in your sentence, the requirements to get married include a health certificate. And that way, the intervention of certain limitations to obtain a reasonable eugenics of species and race, because it's absurd that the reproduction of all beings of flora and fauna can be gradually going toward against the scientific provision, and human reproduction should not be abandoned to any passional influence. So, in a very transparent way, in this constitution, in this code, the eugenic project is present as part of the law. In the work of people who were experts and who were also talking about the subject in this colloquium. Now, I would like to quote he makes a reference, Castanto Beñas, when it comes to a social aspect and regarding the marriage certificate, is nobody will discuss the good eugenic orientation that inspires this measure. So to Castaño is only concerned with the application. Now, in the Sanitary Code of 1926, we see how some people are denied the entrance, especially people who have leprosy or epilepsy, mental imagination, but also other people such as prostitutes, people who consume substances, and they all have something in common. In the legal Mexican framework, in the Sanitary Code of 1926, when it comes to the certificate, with the conditions or with the exceptions, the judges are supposed to demand those who want to get married to ensure that they do not have any kind of illness. So there's an obligation to prove that they do not have any illness.
So we see one of the illnesses to be approved. This is a very familiar law for those eugenics experts. We have a law on eugenics and mental hygiene in Veracruz, where the undesirable ones are being addressed as understood as the ones that are outside the scope of the law. And here it says that the eugenic section is to regulate births, sterilization of those undesirable human samples, how many social roles have a role in an adversarial role in reproduction and in their preservation versus any other degeneration routes. So these family regulation policies that back then were tied back to reproductive rights are linked to a national understanding of a betterment of the race in the country. And so this link, powered by the medical source, have still consequences. Here we have some exhibits to regulation NOM 005, where sterilization is recommended for, and this is quoted mental retardation. So what do we do with all this information? We must ask ourselves why rules with great scope have hindered our progress to the Mexican law. Why? Because, and so I think that the family law is supported not only in the law, in the written law, but in a political project, which, to my knowledge, there is no separation or open discussion about. So to the extent where the race betterment project for the protection of the Mexican people isn't laid down as a topic of discussion, whether or not this is a lawful thing to do, I think it would be really difficult to explain why the legal framework of the family law needs to change in such a way that the requirements by the Human Rights and Disabled Institute is outlining. This goes back to the 1930s and has survived. And so I don't think that this is a result only of it being in the law, but actually of an entitlement or a conviction of what the human rights or the human lives need are entitled to living. So this is a technical discussion in terms of the legal relevance of the rights of persons with disabilities, which wouldn't be enough to disassemble this legal framework. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our three panelists on your very interesting presentation, because we have a lot of material and food for thought comprising a number of places and times. I have a lot of questions stemming from this, and I will let you know of some questions that were put in the chat. Something that draws my attention is that sometimes we have very specific definitions and narrow definitions in the history books about what eugenics is, but we can see, just as in the case of Argentina, that this ends up encompassing way more than we would have typically been understood as a definition of eugenics in terms of reproductive rights. So I think all of this was fascinating, the way in which political moments would shape the term, and maybe in spite of us wanting to put the church position on one side and then the state on the other side, we can see how this is intertwined and how they collaborate in a very intense way. So, and I think that in the Mexican end, despite the fact that we know that eugenics is understood differently depending on the countries and their history and the relationship between eugenics and race, there is something really interesting there as well, in that the law and how we can understand the law throughout time. This changes our understanding of eugenics, and this also teaches us how far it can go than expected. I can just read out a couple of questions that were put in the chat so the audience can have a turn. Okay, first we have some congrats, and then we have some question. Okay, here by Carlos Halaborda, as a matter of fact, one of our panelists. The question reads, well, congrats on your presentation. This is a question for Marisa. In terms of archive, are there study program syllabuses pertaining to the eugenics school, and who was responsible for assigning the syllabus? I don't know if you want to address this question, Marisa. Can you hear me? Okay. Perfect. So I must thank you, Carlos, for your question. Before I can address this question, I would want to openly acknowledge Susan, Beatrice, and all the team that made this possible, even so remotely. So yes, when it comes to the syllabus of the subject matters being taught at these undergraduate courses, this is very interesting because although we were able to access some of those syllabuses, this is not an easy task to do. And so as part of our findings, and which have also been released as part of a paper by Gustavo Vallejo, in a Brazilian magazine, which on a side note, I can just give you the website to this magazine so you can have it looked at. This is a very interesting matter because as part of this togetherness of ideas that are linked between the intersection between biology and politics, there lied as well the syllabuses. So they would have medical branches which were being appropriated from an eugenic standpoint, the legal, ranging all the way to the legal framework, because we must not forget that both medicine, law, and religion are the framework subject matters. I don't want to take much time, so I don't know if I answered this question. Thank you. We would also have the opportunity to come back on any of these topics, but let's carry on with some other questions. There is also another question by Ariana Acevedo, another of our earlier today's panelists. Once eugenics was associated to fascism in Argentina, and has a right-wing opposition disregarded this notion. I cannot be able to say neither of those. I think this answer is a more is a deeper one. On the one hand, the opposition momentum was, this was considered as a criminal understanding, among other things. Besides this political consequences that came with exclusions by eugenics regarding the individual standpoints by eugenics experts, left-wing eugenics experts. This is quite an array of things. On the one hand, we have some of them which as the case of a physician that would put papers on socialist newspapers and so on, where those were scientifically legalized along with other physicians. What happens? Well, they would stick to the eugenic standpoint on the extreme right wing or fascist one. This is interesting because this doctor would face the fascist eugenic experts in a nutshell, and they would say, if they told me, if they measure their children or children's friends with the same measurement as they would measure, I don't know, somebody in poverty or somebody that they were expecting to go wrong on these tests and social control devices. On the other hand, we must acknowledge that there are other left-wing eugenics experts that are more in the post-war eugenics, who were tempted and absorbed by the fascist eugenics, which must be also talked about. Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, I had a question a little bit steered towards Gustavo, but to somebody else if they might take it. I just want to ask you about this historical figure, Carlos Bernardo de Quiroz. And I was curious about seeing what kind of international role he had, maybe beyond that particular personality. What was the importance of international, multinational mailing between eugenics experts in Argentina and Mexico, or with the American ones at this time, starting on the 1940s, with this Argentinian Eugenics Society was founded. Thank you very much, Susan. I don't know if you can hear me well. Yes, okay. I want to thread this point back to what Maria was saying before. It was so difficult to be an opposition that was not from the right wing, because of the scientific legitimacy provided by for eugenics. It was so acknowledged, and these were so renowned individuals that would render void the ability to oppose that, and those who did dare were rather mid-wing or not a part of the academia on the one hand. And now more directly to Bernardo de Quiroz. Well, he is an attorney, an eventual judge, and then he partook in the National Argentinian Eugenics, Social Eugenics Association, like a branch of eugenics pushed by Pendes on an international scope. So a branch of Pendian Eugenics in South America. Bernardo de Quiroz stemmed from that institution. This institution has a really important role on the first instance because he is a part of geopolitical agreements between Argentina and Italy, because Italy was looking to have a fascist light beacon in South America. So they had a political mission on top of a cultural one. And we also had the Italian collective association that was thought of being supportive to Italians in terms of fascist culture embedment in the Americas. So among these, this boils from Italy to Argentina, from Argentina to the rest of the South cone of the Americas. There's even a project aimed at creating an organization supporting Rome as a beacon, as an international beacon of Latino culture. And so Buenos Aires would establish some relationships to create this a Latin university. So the Argentinian Eugenists had this mission to carry this message of creating Athenians simultaneously in Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, and other countries, Peru, in the South American cone. So this is a very direct tie to this mission by eugenics back in the 1930s to foster eugenics and fascism. They even said that the Argentinian eugenics spread movement is one of the most important ones in the Americas, even more so than the magazines published in the US because of the level of dissemination that they had. There's even a moment where a dissemination note on the steps taken by Nazism to foster the prosecution of Jews was a very valuable eugenic step in the Argentinian understanding. And so France both started exchanging after this first publication through Frank's intern. And so they eventually engaged in discussions with Argentinian eugenics. This message was eventually supporting of Nazism was eventually disregarded, but still stems some controversies. Then Bernardo de Quiros, in this first stage, moves within the realm of physicians. This is a time frame where the medical field was extremely important. In 1945, he created an association of lawyers, primarily run by lawyers. This institution will start normalizing from a legal standpoint the Argentinian institutions and outlining new codes, new regulating agencies to through eugenics codification of the law. This was the subject matter of Marisa, who can delve much more into this topic. I just wanted to add something else that was really interesting for me, which I think would be great. We know that time constraints are there that we can talk about later, about Christian's dissertation, because Bernardo de Quiros had won many relationships with Alberto Saavedra from Mexico. And as a matter of fact, the Argentine Eugenics Society, headed by Quiros, would publish with running as a model the Mexican Eugenics Association in 1967, if I'm not mistaken. He addressed a letter to Saavedra, which I have referred to as Eugenics letter to a marrying girl, published by Saavedra. So this is why this is really interesting to talk about eugenics and their relationships. I'm sorry. I mean, this is fascinating. It would be really interesting for Guadalupe to bounce the ball back. I mean, because you talk a little bit about the Veracruz 1932 legislation, which I think would also have a very important tie to Mexican eugenics. So I think it would be really interesting, like what kind of relationships on a political, on a legal sphere could be found between what Gustavo is talking about the South Cone, about what Maria is saying as well, and the Veracruz context that can be seen as a legal freak a little bit in Mexico.
Perdón, Susan, me preguntas sobre las relaciones.
You're asking me about the relations between Mexico and Argentina at this point? I don't know. I think we have some technical issues.
¿Así me escuchan?
Can you hear me?
Ok. ¿Así me oyen?
Desafortunadamente no se oye. Qué pena.
Espera.
Beatriz dice que sí oye. ¿Otra gente escucha?
No. O sea, afuera me oyen, pero ustedes no me oyen.
Colócate en el canal de español, por favor, dice.
Well, if you could move to the Spanish channel.
Guadalupe,
Sí.
en la parte inferior de tu pantalla hay un
Well, in the
icono.
lower part of your screen, there's an interpretation icon. If you could choose Spanish and mute original audio.
Gracias. Preguntaba si me...
Well, my question is, Susan, if it has to do with the bond of this laws of Veracruz, if they have something to do with the laws of Argentina. Yeah, it was to think a little bit more because it was interesting for me, you know, this dialogue of Franz Boas in the Argentinian context, when we know that Franz Boas is important in Mexico because of all the speeches and the classes that he gives in Mexico. So when we see this legislation in Veracruz is a very particular case, and I wondered if we could understand that in the context of fascism or sort of a more international fascism from your point of view. Well, I don't know enough to answer the question per se, but what I see, considering the position or the positions that the governor played, the governor that issued this civil code in 1932, in this sort of unique circumstance in the country, I think that there is the birth of an ideology or the strengthening of an ideology that never got to be completed. That's what I see. Now, on the other hand, what is not very clear for me is how the state of Veracruz develop this precise wording, because as far as I understand, the eugenic forces were not at their very best at the time when these big codes were issued. As far as I understand, that this was the most important legal engine for the creation of the family legislation or the family regulation. Now, the regulation of Veracruz goes beyond than any other regulations in the country, in Mexico. But in this legal map, Veracruz goes late. I mean, so much had already happened when the law of Veracruz emerged. So as far as I know, it was still in use like a couple of years ago. So it was put into practice of a political project. But undoubtedly, there are some connections with ideology, with international ideology that was in circulation at the time. But it was at a declining moment. I think it appeared at a late time. It was not so strong. However, many of these standpoints were present. Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time, but I would like to thank our panelists for the presentations. You provided us with a lot of ideas, information, and hopefully we will have the time to share with you tomorrow in other panels and also in the final discussion. Tomorrow we will all get together and talk around this subject. So thank you so much for those who remained, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Muchas gracias.